Thanks to Dan and Peter, who kindly accepted our invitation to speak today. I want to introduce them to our audience. Dan Swain is a researcher at the Institute of Philosophy of the Czech Academy of Sciences and assistant professor in the Department of Humanities of the Czech University of Life Sciences, Prague. His research focuses on the theory and practice of social movements, radical democracy, and utopianism. Petra Urbana is a senior researcher at the Institute of Philosophy of the Czech Academy of Sciences, and his research focuses on political theory of care, applied ethics, and phenomenology. Today, they will speak on social cohesion contested. Peter and Dan, this scene is yours. Today, we are hosting you as members of the National Psychological Association of Ukraine. Please welcome. We are very interested in the topic of social cohesion due to wartime, due to our observations and our question regarding to what extent social cohesion is possible in wartime and to what extent it is needed now. And if so, on what basis we could build it. So I think today we can have a very interesting presentation and what is no less important and interesting discussion. To our participants, Dan and Peter would talk about an hour, and after that we will have about 30 minutes for questions, commentaries, your thoughts, and discussion generally. So please, Dan and Peter, you're welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Mariana, and thank you to everyone for having us and for inviting us, and we're really happy today. Sorry. We're really happy to be here to talk about the book. I'm just going to very briefly introduce the structure of what we'll talk about before I hand over to Petr to say a bit about kind of how we got to the book and how we got to this theme. So today, what we hope at least that we'll present to you is a little bit about how we got there, about where the book comes from, our own way of thinking about social cohesion, and why it became an issue for us, and how we. I just got a message about my speaking language changing, but hopefully that's not that's okay. Good. So talking about how we got to this problem and kind of how we approached the problem, and then we'll give you a little bit about our approach to a little bit about the kinds of things we discussed in the book, both in terms of the social science side and in terms of some of the particular social policies that we looked at and talked about. And then finally, we'll give you a little bit, I hope, about what is sort of our vision of how I think we hope that it makes sense to talk about social cohesion and the way we think it's most appropriate to approach it. So I will hand over now to Petr initially to talk a little bit about what we did and how we got there.
Yeah, so hello, everybody. Also, I would like to thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to present here for you. So to give you an idea about what is the background of our interest in social cohesion. So there was a joint grant project that Dan and Swain, myself and our colleague Petr Kouba at the Institute of Philosophy, Czech Academy of Sciences, had on the topic, which the title of that grant was Towards a New Ontology of Social Cohesion. And actually what our joint interest was questions, philosophical reflections and questions around topics of solidarity, mutual aid. There was this project together with Catherine Malabou, the French philosopher, which resulted into an edited collection, Unchaining Solidarity. And besides that, my own interest was in political theory of care for a long time. So the topic of solidarity with from the care ethics perspective, and the topic of democracy was also part of our research in this area of, let's say, social philosophy broadly. There was this interesting moment that we decided for the title of that grand project, and there was a moment when we had to also provide some reflections on how the notion that we had as in the title of the project relates to all these our interests. And at that time, Dan and I, we decided to focus on the discourses that are around the notion of social cohesion. And we started with a kind of introductory overview of the literature. And we realized that there is this striking development over the last 3 decades, which is covered in this diagram, which you can see now. And you see the rise of research literature on social cohesion. And that's not only a social science literature, but this is also policy research literature. And this is how it grows up to what are the numbers in 2020. Here you have a table which shows which disciplines are involved in these discourses on social cohesion. This is something that we drew from a paper by Mustakas, and it shows a very diverse group of disciplines. You have, of course, psychology in it, and interestingly, a lot of interest in social cohesion in public environmental occupational health and sociology, of course. And the interest that we had was a philosophical one. So we decided to provide philosophical reflection of what the discourse on social cohesion, both in social sciences and in policies, is about. So we were interested in things that Dan will say in detail in a moment, but the outcome was the book that we already mentioned, and this is a book which was published in the series of Defense of the publisher Rowman and Littlefield in January this year, 2024. And we were very happy to have this impulse to work on something which was quite new for both of us, and it was an endeavor which ended up in our kind of meta level reflection and perspective on social cohesion. And I'm sending it back to Dan here.
Yeah, thank you. So we kind of I suppose confronted with this very growing and big literature about social cohesion. One of the things I think we sort of felt was we began to struggle to pin down what does it really mean, or how is it, and kind of seeing all of the different ways that it was used, we felt that it didn't really make sense for us to come along and just give our own special additional definition, that we didn't see it made sense to sort of just add to the debate or add to the noise with our own alternative, our own definition or approach to social cohesion. And after all, we are not social scientists, we are philosophers, and so we are not really equipped to sort of simply offer our own alternative. Instead, what we did was take the approach that I think, though in some ways we come from quite different traditions of philosophy, what I think we both shared was a desire to sort of take a critical approach towards this concept, and to think about the different ways really that this concept is used and talked about, and some of the, therefore, the tensions and limitations and contradictions within that existing discourse, within the way it was already being talked about. In part, in order to think a little bit more critically about some of the institutions and practices and maybe even social interests that are underlying this concept. Because one of the things we've noticed is that this is a concept that's often operating at the boundaries or at the nexus of social science, policy research, and social policy, and not always being used in exactly the same way across those domains, but often being sort of talked about as if there is a clear shared meaning that we can use and spread and develop on. So we instead tried to take what we can broadly say is a critical social philosophy approach, thinking about how these concepts reflect and are rooted in certain aspects of our societies, and sometimes how they reflect the biases of certain institutions. And so one thing we think, I mean, we are focused on social cohesion here, but in a sense, what we're doing is nothing new or original. It's something that we think could be extended to a number of other similar notions, perhaps social resilience, perhaps well-being, none of which is to say, by the way, that we think, as we'll say later, that we think there's no value in these concepts, but that it's important to think about them in a critical way. And so thanks. So the key claim that that emerged from our research is that social cohesion as a concept frequently acts as what we call, drawing, this is not our own term, this is another term from wider literature, that it operates as a fuzzword. So what it tends to do is obscure meaning as often as it reveals meaning, and so allows itself to be used in a variety of different and often contradictory ways. It's often kind of talked about as if we all know what we mean, and as if we all agree that it's a good thing and it's something we should encourage. And in what we suggest that in practice, that tends to act to shield certain views, certain policies from criticism, because it feels like we all agree or we all know that we value or want to have social cohesion. So in that sense, as is written on the slide, it provides a veneer of general agreement and legitimacy to discourses, policies, and practices that sometimes ought to be more deeply scrutinized and criticized. So that's in a sense, one sense of the word, what the word contested in the title is doing, that we are partly wanting to contest and open up the sense of social cohesion, and we'll come back to that later on in the presentation.
So this is how the contents of the book looks like, and for this presentation today, we decided to pick a couple of themes from the book. So we are, as Dan already said, offering some reflections on universalists' accounts of social cohesion as something which is representative of the literature in social science. What we are not doing today is the content of the chapter 4 from the book, which is devoted to social cohesion in the context of international development. So that's what will stay on the margins today. And we also in the book covered some details on European policies, which we will present today in a sketch, so that you get some outcomes of what in this book was the chapter 3 on European social cohesion policies. There will be a focus on what is the last chapter, which is the contesting social cohesion and our kind of constructive, positive proposal, which makes the outcome and conclusion of the book. So that's how it relates to the book as such.
Okay, so that's back to me again. As Petra just mentioned, in the structure of chapters, one of the one of the things we dedicated quite a lot of time to was looking at and considering the different and various approaches to this concept in social science or social research literature. And we won't give you all of that today, but what we want to focus on today in this part of the presentation is the group of approaches to social cohesion that we call universalist. And what sort of defines these universalist approaches is that they try to give a clear and, as it were, universal definition of what social cohesion is in order to apply it to, if not all societies, at least a kind of as many societies as possible, to enable a kind of measurement and comparison across those societies. So on the slide, you can just see two examples that we talk about in some detail in the book. So the first one from Chan et al., which is, I will just change my what I can see on the screen so I can read it properly. Social cohesion is a state of affairs concerning both the vertical and the horizontal interactions among members of society, as characterized by a set of attitudes and norms that includes trust, a sense of belonging, and the willingness to participate and help, as well as their behavioral manifestations. So that's a frequently cited article in the literature about this topic. The second definition comes from Dragolov et al. From more recently, 2018, from something called the Social Cohesion Radar, which is a broader research project that aimed to measure social cohesion initially across Europe, but I think has also been applied in some other regions as well. And they say that social cohesion is the quality of social cooperation and togetherness of a collective, defined in geopolitical terms, that is expressed in the attitudes and behaviors of its members. A cohesive society is characterized by resilient social relations, a positive emotional connectedness between its members and the community, and a pronounced focus on the common good. And I maximum respect to the person who's doing live translation of me reading those. Well done. So I think that those two examples give a kind of sense of what the goal of offering a universalist definition is doing, which is to say, essentially confronted with or seeing the diversity of ways in which people talk about social cohesion and in which it's been used both in the history of social science and in contemporary political debates, they respond to that uncertainty by saying, let's give a clear definition. Let's attempt to define and clarify what we mean by social cohesion so that we can measure it. So they aim to isolate whatever social cohesion is, something that we can call social cohesion, and isolate it from its causes, its consequences, and define clear either indicators, or sometimes there's the word used is domains or dimensions of social cohesion, and to present a comparison across these different societies. And so I think hopefully you can see on the slide from one report from this social cohesion radar, which gives both a sense in the language that it is aiming at measurement, even the metaphor of a radar that's detecting something that you can't really see, but you can design a very nice tool to measure it. And also even visually, I think I'm not sure how clear you can see, but you can see that they've literally visually represented it as a radar scanning the world for social cohesion, I suppose. So if we can have the next slide. So there's a number of different things we have to say about these kinds of accounts, and a number of different forms of criticism we have. But one important part of it is the way in which the value of social cohesion is represented in these approaches. So it's frequently implied in these approaches that social cohesion is valuable in its own right, that pursuing social cohesion is something that's worth pursuing for itself. Sometimes that is in the simply minimal sense that maybe we all have, that we would like our societies to hold together. We would prefer it more or less if our societies did not fall apart around us, and we would like our societies to hold together. But sometimes there is maybe we could say a more substantive or a broader, richer sense in which they see social cohesion as valuable, which is that it perhaps contains some contains already within it some other values. For example, tolerance or acceptance of diversity is often talked about as a necessary part of social cohesion, or perhaps as social cohesion is kind of manifesting certain other desirable features of human life. And so one side of this idea of why social cohesion is that it seems to be valuable in itself, but then there also seems to be a great deal of effort to illustrate that social cohesion is also instrumentally valuable. That is to say, also valuable for other goals. So there is a quotation here from the social cohesion radar: strong social cohesion is a valuable property, since it's conducive to people's happiness and life satisfaction. And in fact, they even later in the text say cohesion is happiness, which is actually an even more confusing thing to say that it is happiness. I'm not quite sure. But you can see, hopefully that example at least shows you the sense that these different values are sort of woven into the language of social cohesion in quite a complicated way. And so one of the things we suggest is that all of these different ways that social cohesion is represented as valuable contribute to something that we call normative overdetermination. And this is essentially to say that all of these different ways in which we think of social cohesion as valuable, or social cohesion as represented as valuable, contribute to both inflating the significance of the concept, making it seem more and more good, more and more necessary, and at the same time allow for quite a lot of slippages in what people really mean when they use it. Quite a lot of moments essentially where it is unclear in what we really mean when we're talking about social cohesion and why it's valuable. This sort of piling on of different concepts both kind of builds the importance of social cohesion, and at the same time gives lots of space for confusion and slippages around the edges. So if we can have the next slide. So what's wrong with this? What's wrong with these accounts as far as we're concerned? Well, I think there's a few different things we can pick out. I already just mentioned one of them, I think. Perhaps the first thing is that talking about social cohesion as if it is the name of a particular thing, a particular almost substance in the world, what we can think about in terms of ontological realism, meaning that social cohesion is a sort of real measurable thing out there, leads people towards either two possibilities, I think. Either very explicitly trying to develop a concept of social cohesion that is in some sense transhistorical, that could apply in any society, any time in history, any culture, any context. That's quite explicitly actually what Chan seems to be doing in the example I gave earlier. Or to accept and acknowledge that a particular account of social cohesion is culturally specific, does belong to some historical period or location, but continue to sort of talk about it as if it is something real and measurable and out there. And in both cases, we suggest that what that does is risks presenting some kind of contestable, debatable, controversial view of good social cooperation, of ways of living together, as either a purely descriptive concept, so sort of hiding the values behind a descriptive concept, or as at least uncontroversial enough that we all agree with it. And therefore, even if it is a value concept, it's so uncontroversial that it's reasonable to apply it neutrally in policy. So as I think hopefully will become clear later when you look at some of the examples and when we come back to our main conclusions, one of the things this does is shield and protect these policies, these perspectives from criticism, when sometimes they ought to be criticized, or we ought to at least ask deeper questions about what we really mean by these concepts. A further problem, which I already discussed, is this idea of normative overdetermination that I talked about. And there are really, I think, two problems with this. The first is that when you actually then move it into a policy context, so when you take it from the realm of social science to the realm of policy, and you give politicians and policymakers and government actors all of this information to use, it creates all sorts of opportunities for conscious, either unconscious slippages, for possible confusions, or indeed conscious manipulation that make it possible to be used in all sorts of ways. And again, I think you'll see some examples of that later on. And the second is it seems to massively inflate the value of social cohesion itself. And in the most extreme cases, actually, you can see that a socially cohesive society becomes almost identified with a good society, in ways that, again, seem to muddle the picture more than they really illuminate, more than they really help. Indeed, in the authors, again, of this social cohesion radar that I mentioned, they say at one point, simply put, the greater cohesion, the better. And it's not clear to me that that has to be true of our societies. The greater cohesion, the better. Or at least that seems to suggest a very specific understanding of what social cohesion means. The last criticism, which we haven't had so much time to talk about in this presentation, is that, but we will return to it, I think, a little bit later on, is that when it comes to the measurement of social cohesion, they often rely on strikingly thin or depoliticized notions of social activity and participation. These often tend to abstract from the specific ideological, historical, and social content of those forms of participation. So it tends to be about just voting, or just signing a petition, or just participating, all of which might be good, but it does seem to us that it matters perhaps who you're voting for, or which petition you are signing, or what the actual position you are taking within society is. And many of those things seem to be completely abstracted away. There is a tendency, I think, to reduce the significance of quite complicated ideological concepts to very simple measures. And of course, this is not unconnected to the fact that these people want to be able to measure it. There's one line that we mentioned twice in the book from the Social Cohesion Radar, where they say that in the famous French revolutionary motto of liberté, égalité, fraternité, the latter goal, meaning fraternité, seems to be the call of the French Revolution for a cohesive society. And it seems to us that that's only true if you massively flatten and remove all of the context and all of the different interpretations from the history of the world. word fraternity, and that seems to me a problem if we're really to understand what these concepts mean and how they're to be used. And so in the next part, hopefully, we'll see how some of this plays out in practice in the European policy literature, which is the focus of our third chapter. So back over to Petr for that.
Yeah, so as we already mentioned at the beginning, we think that there is a quite complex relationship between social science literature on social cohesion and policy literature on social cohesion, which can be conceptualized as a kind of circle where you can see some first calls and first urges for conceptualizing social cohesion on the level of policy documents, policy papers. And then there is this massive rise of social science literature, which feeds back into policy literature. So in the chapter, which I'm going to summarize here, we looked at the policy documents of two supranational European organizations, namely the European Union and the Council of Europe. And the decision was motivated also by the fact that we are aware of the impact on the national level of these supranational bodies and agencies. So we were interested in especially how these two organizations formulate what they often call strategies for social cohesion, so that there is a clear aim at defining some strategies and even action plans for developing and advancing social cohesion in the European context. And the method which we used here was a close reading and analysis of these documents that are published by these organizations. So we read what is officially published by them, and we were interested mainly in, as Dan said already at the beginning, some inner tensions, some interesting contradictions that are popping up when you analyze these documents. And as you will see, we did a kind of comparison of these two organizations and their approaches, which was significant for our conclusions. So let me start with the European Union and its policies for social cohesion. So first of all, there is a clear priority, like political policy priority of social cohesion, which runs over the last 3 decades. And it's clearly visible in the Treaty on European Union, so-called Maastricht Treaty from 1992, where the European Union formulates the need for developing and pursuing its actions, so the actions of the European Union, leading to the strengthening and its economic and social cohesion. In some of the most recent documents of the European Union, there are clear claims in the same with the same strength of priority for social cohesion, such as this quote from Porto Declaration that more than ever Europe must be the continent of social cohesion and prosperity, which it comes from 2021. And something which is quite in contrast to a notion which has such priority for such a long time is the fact that there is obviously little attempt to specify what social cohesion means and entails in detail. There are quite striking claims and statements that would surprise anybody who is interested in social cohesion in a very rough and broad way. So something like that social cohesion consists in keeping various groups together and offering future for all people, acknowledging diversity, and that the aim is to ensure that people in Europe stick together, which is something that you get after 3 decades of the policy interest in social cohesion in one of the documents. So that's the first contrast that we have observed and that struck us. There is a clear tendency for a call for a more operationalizable concept of social cohesion, which connects to what Dan already described in relation to universalist approaches and their tendency to provide some indicators to measure social cohesion. So the same kind of urge for more measurement and comparison of social cohesion across European countries is clearly visible in these documents of the European Union. And now, what is central? The framework in which the notion of social cohesion appears and the strategies are formulated for the European Union is clearly economy-oriented. And in particular, social cohesion is in the documents of the European Union presented as primarily as a productive factor which contributes to European Union's economic growth and global competitiveness. So even thinking of social cohesion and what are the threats to social cohesion, such as poverty, unemployment, social exclusion. So these phenomena are conceptualized and as unacceptable, but in detail, then it's clear that they are mainly unacceptable because they are primarily, they represent obstacles to the greater efficiency in European society. So there is this strong economy-centered perspective, and this is also, again, in contrast, striking contrast with the statements that are present in these documents and that claim that social cohesion is also an important goal on its own right. So we have the economization, but at the same time, the claim that it's an important goal in its own right. And this translates to what are the concrete measures that are proposed by the European Union for social cohesion strategy. And the main concrete measure proposed by the European Union is active employment policy. So once we think of poverty, unemployment as unacceptable, because this is the obstacle for greater efficiency in European society, so then reinsertion of disadvantaged groups and individuals into the labor market seems to be the best safeguard against social exclusion, as the Lisbon strategy of the European Union claims. And the very notion of solidarity gets a quite surprising twist here, which is that it is framed also in the context of active employment policy. So active solidarity is conceived as a response to the threat of unused human capital. So back to the labor market and reinsert those that are outside of it. Now, the perspective of the Council of Europe, this bigger, broader organization, which includes more than, of course, the member states of the European Union. It includes Ukraine, of course. So the perspective of this organization is from the very beginning, from the 1990s, focusing on or emphasizing quite different point of departure, namely the perspective of social justice, social rights. So we call this approach rights-based approach. And the core idea behind this approach is that strengthening social cohesion is improving access to social rights for members of European society. So that social cohesion means promoting Europe of social rights. This also translates to the concrete policies. Now, the concrete policies that the Council of Europe proposes are policies around housing, policies around education, healthcare, work and family. So that's a broader spectrum of policies which relates to the social rights of members of European societies. And also the concept of social exclusion here is framed around the notion of social rights. So the threat and the decline of social cohesion is perceived as a decline in terms of social exclusion and lack of access to fulfilling social rights. As Dan already mentioned, the question of value of social cohesion. So in this approach of the Council of Europe, we can clearly see that social cohesion is considered as valuable, first, again, for its own sake. So it's something which is valuable per se, but at the same time, it's conceived as valuable as a means for many different goals, such as social justice, already mentioned, democratic security, human development, and economic development too, in the end. The unique character of the approach of Council of Europe is also in its attempt to provide some more precise definition of social cohesion. So what we see is a series of three strategies for social cohesion published from 2000 up to 2010. And in these three strategies, there is an attempt to come up with a more precise definition. And the definition is centered around the notion of well-being. The analysis of these documents shows that these core notions, such as well-being or welfare, are not analyzed enough there. They are not provided satisfactory accounts of these notions. So there are some seminal core notions used to define social cohesion for the Council of Europe, but it's quite unclear, vague, and sort of fluid what we can mean by well-being or welfare, these central notions there. And finally, this is similar to the account and approach of the European Union. There is a call for measurement, comparison, assessment in progress in strengthening social cohesion across European countries. So now I'm getting to the core points of the comparison. So as already said, we have the economy-oriented approach of the European Union on the one side, and the rights-based approach which focuses on the notion of social justice and social rights of the Council of Europe. On the level of concrete policies, there is this contrast between reinsertion into labor market as what is offered and proposed by the European Union as a main measure, and in contrast to securing effective access to social rights by the Council of Europe. And finally, there is this broad spectrum of policies around housing, healthcare, education, as compared to the policy of active employment of the European Union. And now where we see some problems and some points of for critical reflection here. So first of all, there is an issue around the way that both these organizations, in this vast amount of documents that they provide on social cohesion and their strategy for social cohesion, so that the way they use the notion can be characterized and as quite vague, ambiguous, and fluid. There is an issue with the use of other concepts that should help to define, as we see with the Council of Europe. Second, similarly to what the universalist account of social cohesion tends to do, that it here both organizations sort of offer the discourse of social cohesion as something which is desirable and which elicits agreement. So everybody would want the society to be cohesive, but quite different political agendas and different even ideological agendas are hidden behind these broad normatively laden ways of talking about social cohesion in both organizations. Third, we see the normative overdetermination, which we mentioned previously. And finally, the problem lies in the neutrality of that notion, which is sort of depoliticized and deprived of contestability. So that's why we came up with the idea of what is needed here is in the context where we know that the discourse of social cohesion will continue, is to offer some ways of more critical approach to that notion, and especially making that notion politicized and contested again, or if it ever was, maybe for the first time, making it contested. And that's where I send it to Dan back for the last part. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So yeah, as Petr left off, if the problem with social cohesion, or with the way the concept is used in the discourse that we're criticizing, is that it tends to shield policies from criticism, or tends to be used in these ambiguous ways, we think it makes more sense we think that the solution is to think about it more clearly as a contested concept, and also to be more actively contesting its meaning. So if I can have the next slide. So to put it bluntly, when writing this book, at least me, I had many moments where I just thought maybe we should just really stop talking about social cohesion at all. Maybe the solution is to tell everyone to stop talking about it, but that doesn't seem very likely, that people will just stop just because we tell them to, or that indeed that people would stop using the concept at all. So it seems that if we can't abandon the concept, we should contest it, or maybe it's better to say open it to contestation. We didn't talk today about the international development context, but one of the international development documents that we looked at very explicitly said there is a need to depoliticize social cohesion. And I understand what that author means. They mean they don't want it to be, as in the English phrase, a political football, that they don't want it to be turned into a kind of issue for purely playing politics around, especially playing party politics around. But actually, in a very important sense, that's where we disagree with a lot of the discourse, is we don't agree that it is helpful to try to depoliticize social cohesion. In fact, in a certain way, it makes sense to politicize social cohesion, to open it to debate and contestation. Very loosely, I think we can say that we mean contestation in two slightly different senses. The first is this first sense that I meant, which is to, in a way, be more honest and open about the values and ideologies and political agendas that it is connected to. So partially that is demystifying the concept. So thinking about the historically specific roots of where it came from. And remember those diagrams we showed you at the beginning. It's not a concept that people have always talked about. It's a concept that's taken off in a moment. So we should think about looking at the roots of that takeoff and its actual effects. We can also think about deflating these concepts. So trying to more carefully separate the value elements of the concept from the social policy elements, from the assumptions about it being intrinsically good. We didn't talk again today about some of the other approaches, but there are approaches that try to sort of avoid assuming that social cohesion is a good thing, that you might in fact have too much social cohesion, or that social cohesion might be a bad thing in certain contexts. And another useful concept or useful way of thinking about this we found is the idea of an essentially contested concept, which is an idea introduced by the philosopher W.B. Galley in the 1950s. And he argues that essentially contested concepts are concepts where the debate about the meaning of the concept in a certain way sustains the value of that concept. So his classical example of this is democracy, where it seems that part of the debates about what democracy means and the fact that democracy is open to interpretation and debate in a certain way sustains the very value of democracy itself. Now, we are not sure, or at least I am not sure, whether or not social cohesion counts as one of those concepts. It might just be a contested concept as opposed to an essentially contested concept. But it's a useful framework nonetheless, I think, for thinking about how we might approach these concepts in a more open and critical way. And the second sense of contestation that we look for is actively trying to look to parts of this discourse that encourage democratic deliberation and reflective cooperation. So in a way, this is us just putting our values on the table. We think democracy is good. We think deepening democracy is good, and allowing people to genuinely participate in thinking about what a good society looks like for them is a good thing. And so if we're confronted with this discourse about social cohesion that we think sometimes tends to shut down debate, or sometimes tends to make it harder to criticize, then what we want to do is sort of change the terms of the debate by bringing forward some concepts that are more critical within this discourse and rearrange, as it were, how things how the discussion happens. And we're influenced partly by that, although I would say neither of us are fully signed up to this idea. We are influenced partly by the idea associated with the philosophers or social theorists Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe, the idea of chains of equivalence, which is to say that these concepts are sort of strung together in a chain of similarities, but by moving the concepts around the chain or introducing new concepts, we can also shift how we think about the full picture and relationship of those concepts. So in the final chapter of the book, what we do is suggest 4 such concepts, which we see in the literature and which we see as a sort of possible places for rethinking or taking on more critically some of this material. And we'll just talk, to end today, we'll just talk briefly about each of those 4 concepts and how we think that might work. So the first such concept is equality or inequality. In the discourse on social cohesion, equality enters in a number of different ways. So in some of the earliest literature that Petra was talking about from the European Union, there is social cohesion policies are responding to a fear of inequality, a sense that inequality is a threat. So these very first documents talk about bridging the gap between the included and the excluded. And this only kind of develops more in the later years, especially the years after the economic crisis of 2008, when there was a growing reattention focused on inequality as a problem in itself, not only as a problem of poverty or exclusion, but inequality even among groups that are perhaps not starving or not on the poverty line, but how inequalities nonetheless lead to certain kinds of social problems in themselves. This is linked to what Mike Savage, the sociologist, calls the return of inequality in his most recent book. And in the social cohesion radar, which I spoke about earlier, inequality is seen as something that threatens social cohesion, and therefore social cohesion is, and by inequality is meant income inequality, the gap between the richest and the poorest in terms of income, is seen as a threat to social cohesion. So this is, of course, I put on the slide as well that Barack Obama gave a speech saying inequality is the defining challenge of our time. So there is an example, it seems to us, where the concern with inequality is a space for a deeper and more sustained criticism of many aspects of our existing societies. However, much of the literature that we look at focuses only on income inequality. But as Mike Savage observes in the book I mentioned before, in fact, if you focus instead on wealth inequality instead of income inequality, you get a very different picture. So while somewhere like the United States of America has very high wealth inequality and very high income inequality, the countries like Germany, Austria, and Scandinavia, the Scandinavian countries, have very low levels of income equality, but very, very high levels of wealth inequality. And so focusing on that picture might already call into question some of our maybe traditional ideas about which countries count as models to follow in this picture. And indeed, Germany, Austria, and the Scandinavian countries are countries that tend to score very high on measures of social cohesion, but perhaps wouldn't if we emphasized wealth inequality instead of income inequality. It also opens us to other questions of extraction and exploitation, and what Savage calls visceral inequality, the way that inequality is embodied and experienced. It's not merely an abstract category of how much do you earn, where you sit on a spreadsheet, but really how we feel inequality through our relationships to other people and in our bodies. A final thing we might say about equality is that if we instead focus not on inequality, but on equality, we might similarly get a very different picture. So instead of thinking about inequality as a threat to be minimized, we might instead think about equality as a value in its own right, something to be promoted, and thus ask the question how we can really live together as equals, which would surely have to be much more than just, in the examples Petra gave, making sure everyone has a job or making sure everyone meets a social minimum, but how we are able in democratic institutions or in our social life to really treat each other as equals in a much richer and more participatory way. Next slide. The second concept that we want to look at, or that we propose as a place to look at, is the concept of solidarity. So solidarity has a slightly different place from inequality inequality is represented in the discourse as a threat that something that is linked causally to social cohesion, whereas solidarity is often identified with social cohesion directly. Sometimes solidarity is just seen as a synonym of social cohesion. But one thing we point to in the book is that historically the idea of solidarity was often used quite differently. It wasn't simply used as a basis for sustaining society, but also as a way of challenging society, of challenging the form of existing society to create alternative forms of solidarity. This was a principle of the socialist labor movement, the idea that that through the solidarity of working class organizations, you might build a different kind of society. It's also at the core of many anarchist practices of mutual aid and self-organization, people who believe that when you are engaged in practices of mutual aid and helping others, you are precisely not doing it only as charity, but you are creating you are doing it on the basis of a shared interest and a shared stake in some kind of future alternative. So what we argue on the one hand is that social cohesion, too much focus on social cohesion can miss the transformative possibilities of solidarity, the way in which solidarity can also transform our society, point beyond our society in a potentially a positive way, in favor of a kind of logic of just holding things together. But at the same time, precisely because solidarity is part of this discourse, it creates opportunities for people to shift the narrative in favor of a more critical approach. We also, by the way, we haven't talked about this nearly enough, so perhaps this slide is a bit unclear, but it also raises the question of solidarity with who, and the question, therefore, of who counts as part of your society. And in particular raises the question of cross-border solidarities and solidarities internationally that might not, again, be easily picked up when we think of social cohesion as something to be measured at the level of an individual country. Okay, next slide. The third such example is pluralism, which is a slightly different, again, plays a slightly different role in the discourse. Social cohesion is often seen as needing to react to the fact of diversity, or the fact that we live in diverse societies, and therefore requiring some kind of tolerance or acceptance of diversity. We've been in the book, we're critical of that in a few different ways, not because we don't like tolerance and not because we don't think you should be accepting of diversity, but because sometimes those can hide very specific and quite controversial value judgments. For example, my country, where I'm from, the tolerance has recently been inscribed as a British value as part of policies which often are designed, in fact, to exclude people who are not seen as living according to British values, and are therefore sort of deemed intolerant and worthy of exclusion. Similarly, we see in the international development literature that this idea of pluralism is often used to kind of to reflect a desire that countries should be able to decide for themselves about what they do in development, but then often in practice, one model is imposed on them from outside. And so there's often a tension between this sort of bottom up and top down. And what we argue very simply is we should push much deeper into the pluralism. We have to reject the idea that there is one idea of social cohesion that fits everyone and can be measured and quantified and applied. And instead think in terms of what, for example, Arturo Escobar calls the pluriverse, adapting the Zapatista slogan, that they want a world in which many worlds might fit. And it seems to us that if we are serious about pluralism as being part of this picture, we have to be open to the fact that social cohesion may look very different in very different places, or rather that people, to maybe put it better, people should be able to decide for themselves what social cohesion looks like and what they understand social cohesion to mean, if it is to mean anything at all. Okay, last slide. And finally, and I can see we've been talking for pretty much an hour, so I will say this quickly. A final element of the discourse that we want to kind of open up is the way in which they talk about the idea of the common good. One, again, this is mainly taking the example from the social cohesion radar. They stress that an orientation on the common good is a component, a necessary part of social cohesion. But when we talk about the common good, there is an important ambiguity or an important double meaning here that we should be careful about. Sometimes people use the common good to refer to a simple adding up, an aggregate of all of the individual goods of people. And in that sense, perhaps all an orientation on the common good means is maximizing this aggregate by thinking about the goods of other people. So if I attend to the common good, I try to make your life better and you try to make my life better, but we're measuring it each on a kind of individual scale. But an alternative view of the common good suggested, for example, though not uniquely, but for example, by the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, is that we can see the common good as something that cannot be reduced to individual goods. That, as MacIntyre puts it, not only achieved by means of cooperative activity, but in key part constituted by cooperative activity. So that the common good emerges from common activity through our debates and discussions about what it is, about what it means, not only as something that exists sort of prior to us that we can measure. And again, then, we think that challenge, that while both visions are there in the literature, we think that it's the first view that tends to dominate, and instead we should push forward the latter view, the view that the common good is more than just us as individuals, but something we can achieve collectively together. And that, we think, should open us to thinking about what institutions, what parts of our societies allow us to articulate these cooperative goods, these visions of the common goods. And there are some examples on the slide, but I've been talking long enough. So I think that's it for us. Thank you so much for your attention.